The wind had gone dry again. It whistled through the broken slats of the porch rail, rattling the old copper bell that hung above the gate. Elias Boone didn't move. He stood barefoot in the dust beside the well, one hand resting on the pump handle, the other wrapped around a rusted tin cup filled with silence. The sun angled low, coppering the field, turning every nailhead and horseshoe into a tiny sun of its own. From the ridge came the creak of wheels. Not the kind from town. These were older, splintered, uneven. He heard the metal sing against stone before the rattle grew closer. By the time he turned, a wagon was already half down the hill, cloaked in grit, and pulled by a mule that looked too tired to argue. No flag, no signal, no reason. Just dust and a shape headed for his gate. Boone didn't squint, didn't shade his eyes. He simply watched, still as a dead cottonwood, until the wagon rolled to a stop just past the split fence. The driver was thin, hat pulled low, eyes that wouldn't meet Boone's. He nodded once and said, "Got a message," then reached under the seat and pulled out a folded letter sealed in red wax. Boone took it, but didn't open it, not right away. Instead, he studied the back of the wagon, where two figures sat huddled under a threadbare shawl. Girls, maybe women, young, Apache. Dirty around the edges, but upright. One held the other's hand like it was all she had left in the world. Boone stepped back, not in fear, just to feel the ground again. He turned the letter slowly, like the name might change if he waited long enough. It didn't. To Mr. Elias Boone. That name hadn't been spoken on this land in years, only whispered, only in warnings. He cracked the seal. 3 lines, polite, kind. Found these girls near the old calico shaft. Said they were being hunted. I figured if anyone could keep them alive, it was the man who once saved mine. Consider this a repayment of debt. The mule shifted. One of the girls looked up. Boone folded the letter in half and slipped it into his coat. He looked once, just once, into her eyes. Then he turned back toward the house. He didn't tell them to follow, but they did. And as the wind shifted behind him, he whispered, not to them, but to the air that had kept him company all these years. "The Lord is near to the broken-hearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. The floor creaked when he stepped inside. Not from age, he'd replaced the boards 3 winters ago, but from memory. Everything in the house held memory like breath in a quiet room. The cast-iron kettle on the hook, the single chair by the window, the Bible on the mantel with a page forever folded where her favorite psalm used to be. Boone hung his coat, but kept the letter in his pocket. He lit the lamp, not because the light was failing, but because the dark had always come faster when strangers were near. The girls stood at the door. They hadn't spoken, not even a whisper between them. The taller one, thinner, sharper in the eyes, held herself like a shield. The smaller, perhaps the younger, looked at the walls like they held questions no one had ever answered. Boone said nothing. He moved to the stove, ladled soup from the pot he'd left simmering, and placed 3 bowls on the table. No grace, no ceremony, just hot food and silence. Then the sound that broke the evening, the chains. They weren't thick, not like shackles made for work camps, but they were iron, and iron had memory. The girls still wore them around their ankles, loose but there. Boone reached into the drawer beneath the sink, pulled out a chisel and a mallet. Not new, not clean. He didn't speak, just knelt. The first girl hesitated. Then, slowly, warily, she extended her foot. With one strike, the iron opened. Then the other. The metal dropped to the floor like an old sin being named. Boone gathered the chains and placed them in a box under the sink.
a box wrapped in oilcloth, a box he hadn't opened in 20 years. The taller girl watched his every move, not like a child afraid, more like someone counting breaths between storms. He stood. "Eat," he said. They did, slowly, like animals too long denied peace. They didn't thank him, and he didn't expect it. The air between them wasn't made for talk. When the bowls were empty, Boone reached for the kettle again. The girls flinched, barely, but he noticed. He poured water into a cup and placed it near the hearth. Then, without a word, he opened the door to the spare room. The room had once belonged to a boy. Its emptiness now spoke louder than any man. "You sleep there," he said. "No locks, no watching, no price." The younger girl blinked like she didn't understand. The older one nodded. They stepped in, closed the door. Boone returned to his chair, unfolded the letter again, read it once more, then tossed it into the fire without a word. Night fell like it had always fallen here, slow, wide, and cold. Boone sat in the high-backed chair near the hearth, eyes fixed on the coals. He didn't rock, didn't sip from the cup beside him, just sat there, hands resting on his knees, a man halfway between sleep and something deeper. Behind the wall, floorboards creaked. The girls were awake, whispering in a language that had been spoken on this land long before Boone's father ever carved a fence post. He didn't understand it, but he understood the tone. Soft, unsure, still coiled in fear. He made no move toward the sound. Instead, he reached for the small book atop the mantel. Its spine was cracked, leather worn thin at the corners. Pages lined with notes that were not his. Her hand, smaller, slanted, always in blue ink. Boone opened to the fold she'd kept. Psalm 34, verse 18. He didn't need to read it. He'd memorized it the day he buried her. But still, he mouthed the words, like touching a name on stone. "The Lord is near to the broken-hearted and saves the crushed in spirit." The wind outside howled through the chimney, and the fire flinched, throwing shadows across the old wooden floor. One of the girls stirred again. Boone didn't look. He let the room settle back into silence. He stood slowly, joints stiff from years of cattle work, and crossed to the window. The glass was pocked with age, the frame warped, but he could still see the moonlit ridge above the valley. The trail was empty. No torches, no watchers. Not yet. Behind him, the fire sighed. Boone turned back, picked up the third bowl still resting on the table, untouched. He didn't toss the contents. Instead, he placed the bowl back on the hearth, close to the fire, as if someone might still come for it. Then he pulled a blanket from the chest and laid it across the empty couch. He didn't know why. Perhaps because it felt wrong to sleep when two ghosts had walked through his gate that day and hadn't asked a single question. Perhaps because the kind of men who sent girls as messages rarely stopped at letters. He sat down again, placed the old Bible on his lap, and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to wait. The night was quiet now, but it would not stay that way. Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. The sun rose slow across Boone's land, as if it too was unsure whether it should return. Dust lifted in lazy swirls behind the cattle gate, and somewhere beyond the ridge a hawk cried once, then vanished. Elias stood with one boot resting against the fence, tightening the last knot of twine with a quiet precision born not of duty, but of habit. He didn't look back at the cabin. He didn't need to. He knew they were watching. Taya was the first to step outside that morning. She wore a plain blouse folded at the sleeves and moved like someone raised in shadow, deliberate, silent, alert. Her eyes scanned the land, then lingered on the horses. She approached them slowly, hand out, whispering something Elias couldn't hear. Luma came later, holding a worn scarf in both hands. She looked younger in the light, but there was a set to her jaw that spoke of things no girl should carry. She didn't speak either, just stood near the tool shed until Elias handed her a coil of rope and pointed to the post by the trough. He didn't smile. They didn't nod. But the work began. By mid-morning, the three of them moved in quiet rhythm, Boone driving the posts, Taya checking the bridles, Luma learning how to braid the rawhide into loops tight enough for fence ties. There was no sound but the scrape of rope, the grind of boots against dirt, and the creak of old leather. When the noon sun struck high, Elias pulled a jug of water from the well and passed it without word. Taya drank first, then Luma. Then Elias poured a cup for the ground, slow and steady, letting it soak the roots of the juniper tree nearby. "They say this tree marks a vein," he muttered. "Old roots find old bones." It wasn't a proverb. It was memory. The afternoon passed in low light and longer shadows. Taya disappeared once, into the hills beyond the paddock, but returned with wildflowers and a dusty book of sketches she'd kept hidden in the folds of her satchel. Luma stayed closer. Her hands never stopped moving, even when her eyes drifted toward the lone tree on the hill behind the cabin. That night, when the stars returned, Elias stood outside sharpening his blade by lantern. The grindstone echoed like an old song. The wind had dropped to a hush. He heard it before he saw her. Luma. Kneeling before a small wooden cross on the hill, the only one in sight, wrapped in her scarf like a prayer. Her shoulders shook, once, then again, but she didn't cry out. She sat, quiet, hands pressed into the dry earth, as if trying to remember someone else's grief. Elias didn't move toward her, but his hand paused mid-grind. He lowered the blade, blew out the lantern, and stood there in the dark, hat to his chest, head bowed, not because she was mourning, but because someone finally remembered that grief had lived here long before them. The wind changed the next morning. It came from the north, cooler than usual for that time of year, stirring the curtains in the cabin with a kind of unsettled whisper. Elias felt it before he opened the door. Something about the way the air carried the scent of iron and ash, like storm clouds with no rain. The girls were already outside. Taya was brushing down the mare, her movements deliberate, steady. Luma was tying a bundle of dried rosemary near the back window, where the smoke from the kitchen flue rose in soft spirals. Boone watched them for a moment, then stepped back inside and lit the stove. He stirred the kettle twice, reached for the old cup with the chipped rim, her cup, and paused. He didn't drink. Instead, he wrapped the cup in an oilcloth and placed it back on the top shelf. That was the second time in 2 days he'd touched something he hadn't touched in years, and he noticed it. That afternoon, as the sky dimmed behind a line of pale thunderheads, Boone led the girls past the fence line, toward the hill. They didn't speak. He carried a tin bucket with 3 apples and a folded cloth. The girls didn't ask why. At the top, beneath the juniper tree, was a second cross, unmarked. The wind picked up. Elias knelt beside it, pulled back a patch of tall grass, and laid the cloth down flat. He placed the apples gently, 2 red, 1 green. Then he sat, not on the grass, but on the edge of a worn stone, tucked halfway into the earth. He didn't look at the girls. He looked past them. To some it was fever, he said finally. Others said the water had gone bad. The mine blamed the dust. His voice was low, not cracked, just quiet enough that the words didn't carry far. She took sick fast. Boy followed 2 days later. I buried them myself. The girls said nothing. He reached into his coat and took out a small strip of leather, weathered at the ends. He ran his thumb across it, then handed it to Luma. It was a child's name tag, just 3 letters burned into the leather. Ben. She held it like it might disappear in her hands. "I haven't told anyone that," Boone added. A pause, then softer than before. "There are wounds that never speak, but never close either. They simply shape the silence." He stood slowly, not stiff, but aged in that moment. He didn't brush the dirt from his knees, didn't reclaim the leather. He let it stay in her hands. As they walked down the hill together, the wind began to fall. And from the far distance, across the dry stretch of basin where nothing but bones dared settle, 3 black crows lifted off the ground and vanished into the evening light. The nights had grown quieter. Not silent, but quieter, like the land itself was listening. Coyotes still cried out from the canyon at dusk, but they felt farther now, held at bay not by fences, but by the hush that had settled inside Elias Boone's home. That hush was broken on the 5th night. It came in a whisper. Elias had stepped out to refill the lantern. He walked slow, his right knee stiff from years of ranch work, and when he turned the corner near the side of the cabin, he heard them. Not screams, not sobs, just voices, low, rushed, urgent. Taya's voice sharp with worry, Luma's soft and breaking. "If we don't find it," Taya said, "they'll die." Boone didn't move, didn't breathe. "I don't know how much longer we have," Luma answered. "They'll take them deeper, maybe already have." A pause. Then the words that struck him harder than any bullet he'd ever dodged. "He said the man here, Boone, was the last one who saw it. The box, the papers. Before it disappeared." Elias stepped back, careful not to let the gravel under his boot shift. He didn't need to hear more. He had heard enough. He didn't storm in. He didn't demand. He didn't raise his voice. He returned to the cabin and set the lantern on the table. He sat, slow, in the chair beneath the rifle hooks. He took his time wiping the blade he'd left unfinished the night before. Then he stood, walked out, crossed the yard, knocked on their door, 3 soft raps. The girls opened it together. No surprise, they had expected him. Taya looked ready to fight. Her hands were tight at her side, eyes hard with instinct, like a fox with no more places left to run. Boone didn't ask a question, didn't offer judgment. He simply said, "If there's truth to speak, I'll listen." The wind rustled the dry leaves behind them. Taya stepped aside. They sat by the fire that night. No light but the flame. No food, just the hush of pine logs splitting. It was Luma who began. She told him of a mine far south. Calico, they called it. But it was no longer a mine. It was a prison now. And their parents, Apache trackers, healers, once respected even among the settlers, had been taken years ago. Not killed, not released, just vanished into the earth with hundreds of others. Brentwood kept them there, they said, not in cells, but in caves made to look abandoned. Boone listened. They said someone once tried to expose him, a merchant, sympathetic. He had records, names, documents. He never made it to town. "They said he gave it to you," Taya whispered. "A box. You buried it." Boone stared into the fire. The flame flickered. The shadows moved. He didn't deny it. He just stood, slow and quiet, and walked outside, into the dark. The rifle came down from the wall with the weight of memory. He didn't shoulder it. He simply stood at the edge of the porch and looked west, toward the ridge where the trail once ran, toward the place he hadn't gone in 20 years, toward the place where bones slept and secrets waited. They didn't speak the next morning, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence now had weight. Boone had spent the night outside, by the barn, sharpening the same blade twice over and staring at nothing in particular. The stars had dimmed by dawn, and the hills behind the house were still wrapped in mist. Taya and Luma waited at the table, eyes hollow with sleepless worry. When Boone stepped inside, he carried an old tobacco tin, rusted at the edges, sealed with a strip of cloth and wax. He didn't set it down. He just looked at them, one by one, and asked, "How much do you know of the man who sent you?" Luma hesitated, then nodded once, like she'd been waiting for permission to speak the truth. "He calls himself a patron," she said, "to the government, to the church, even to the Apache sometimes." Taya's eyes darkened. "But we knew early. He took our cousins first, said it was for trade. When they never came back, my father asked questions." Boone moved to the hearth, kneeling beside the fire. He held the tin over the flame, turning it slowly until the wax seal began to soften and peel. "He was there, you know," Elias muttered, "back when the mine collapsed. Hollis Brentwood. Said he'd come to help. Rode in with a deputy badge he'd made himself." The girl said nothing. "He asked for names, survivors. Claimed it was for records. Said the law needed to count the dead." He paused, then added, "He wasn't counting. He was erasing." The tin gave way with a faint crack. In an envelope, yellowed and sealed in twine, a set of notes written in cramped cursive, and a small leather-bound booklet with a broken spine and a single brass clasp. Boone opened it, careful. The pages trembled. Handwritten lists, transactions, names of tribal children bought as temporary workers, medical files altered, shipments rerouted from Fort Apache to mines east of Calico. Even bounty records marked cleared. Near the back, one note stood out, unsigned. "Transfer complete. Boone held no suspicion. Family will not return." Taya inhaled sharp through her teeth. "He used your name, lied." Boone didn't answer. Instead, he placed the envelope on the table, beside a second item, a small silver coin, Spanish, worn, one side chipped from what looked like fire. "What is that?" Luma whispered. Boone didn't touch it. He always carried one, said it was proof of God's blessing on enterprise. Taya stared at it. "Now it's just proof of blood." The fire cracked. Boone stepped back. "I buried this," he said, "because I thought it would bury the guilt with it." He looked out the window. But it didn't. It just gave it roots. Silence fell again. This time, it was Luma who broke it. So what now? Boone reached for the pen beside the ledger he hadn't used in years. "We write," he said. "To whom?" He stared at the flame. "To the one man he's afraid of." The sun set early that evening, as if the sky itself didn't want to watch what came next. Elias Boone stood behind the barn with a shovel in hand, staring at a stretch of earth that hadn't been disturbed in over 2 decades. The soil was dry, cracked in places, and overgrown with buffalo grass, but he remembered the exact spot. He always had. Taya and Luma stood a few steps back, silent. Boone knelt first, drove the shovel in hard, once, then again. The ground gave slowly. Each strike echoed louder than it should have, like the land was reluctant to yield what it had kept hidden. It took half an hour, and when he finally pried the old wooden box from beneath the dust, it came up like a coffin, square, nailed shut, stained from years of silence. He sat it down on the wagon bench and opened it. No gold, no maps of buried treasure, no weapons. Inside, papers, tied in stacks. A second ledger, this one older, stained with oil and blood. A rolled-up blueprint of what looked like mine tunnels. And wrapped in oilcloth, a folded letter addressed not to Boone, but to a judge in Tucson. Boone handed the letter to Taya. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. He nodded. "A man's last try." "Yours?" He shook his head. "Someone braver." Taya unfolded it gently. The writing was careful, deliberate. It named Brentwood. It listed properties, dates, witnesses. It described a scheme stretching 2 states, dozens of families, and half a lifetime of stolen names. "Why didn't you send this?" she asked. Boone stared out toward the hills. "Because I thought if I burned it, the ghosts would stay quiet." Luma stepped forward, brushing dust from the blueprint. "Calico," she said. "This is where they're held?" Boone answered, "If the tunnels are still standing, yes." They stood around the box as dusk deepened into blue. Boone spoke again. "We write a letter," he said. "Say we have what he lost. Say we'll trade it for the parents." Taya tensed. "But it's a lie. We'd never give it back." Boone looked at her. "No," he said, "but he doesn't know that." They moved inside. For hours they worked over the table by lamplight. Taya penned the letter, her hand steady, her words chosen like arrows. Elias dictated only the parts that mattered: tone, time, location. The letter was to be delivered by a rider Boone trusted from a nearby mission town. It would reach Brentwood in 2 days. "He'll come alone," Boone said. "He always did the dirtiest work himself." They sealed the letter. Taya stared at it for a long time, then looked to Elias. "If he comes armed?" Boone's voice was soft but firm. "He will." He walked to the mantel, opened a small drawer, and retrieved a knife in a leather sheath. It wasn't large, just a palm's length, but the blade gleamed with new edge. He handed it to Taya. She didn't flinch. "This is not for vengeance," he said. "It's for time." Taya looked down at it. "For time?" He nodded. "For when words run out, and you still have to live." They didn't speak after that. The wind picked up. The lantern flickered. And somewhere outside, the coyotes were quiet for the first time in weeks. The fire burned low, the kind of low that meant it had been burning for a while, and no one had bothered to feed it. Sparks curled upward now and then, drifting toward the rafters like they too had somewhere better to go. Elias sat across from the flames, one hand resting on the worn arm of the chair, the other wrapped loosely around a tin cup filled with something that had long gone cold. Taya sat on the floor, knees drawn close, the knife he'd given her resting beside her ankle. Neither spoke for a long time. Outside, the wind had calmed, the world held its breath. "I used to think survival was enough," Elias said finally. His voice cracked, not from emotion, but from disuse. He rarely spoke more than a sentence at a time. Tonight, he broke his rule. "You lose folks, you bury them, and you keep going because you think that's what they'd want. You don't cry, not because you're strong, but because crying means remembering. And remembering," he paused, sipping the cold drink, "hurts." Taya didn't interrupt. She didn't move. "I wasn't brave," he continued. "When the merchant brought me the box, I told myself I'd take it to the marshal in Tucson, but I didn't. I buried it, and then I buried myself with it." Taya turned her face slightly, the fire casting flickers of gold across her skin. "You didn't know," she said. Elias met her eyes, sharp, clear, old as dust, but still steady. "I did," he said. "I just didn't want to carry the weight of doing something about it." They sat again in silence. The knife by Taya's ankle caught the firelight. She picked it up, felt the cool steel between her fingers. "Have you ever?" she asked softly. Elias didn't blink. "Yes." A pause. "Was it hard?" "No." Another pause. "Would it be now?" He looked away. "That depends on what's left of me." The wind moved again, just enough to rattle the front window. Taya placed the knife back on the floor, but closer this time, closer to her hand. "I'm not afraid of dying," she whispered. "I just don't want to die without doing something that matters." Boone looked at her, not with sympathy, but with understanding. It was the first time he saw her not as a child forced into hardship, but as someone forged in it. "There's a verse," he said, "from a letter Paul wrote." He didn't quote it all at once. He let it hang, like a bell after the last toll. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Romans 12:21. The words didn't float. They sank, slow, heavy, like truth often does. Neither of them said anything after that. When Taya rose, she didn't ask for a blanket, didn't nod, just picked up the knife and walked to the small room near the rear of the cabin. Elias stayed where he was, eyes on the embers. The fire would go out soon. But something else, older, quieter, and far more dangerous, had just begun to stir. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. They arrived at dawn, when the shadows were long and the chill still clung to the rocks like regret. The old mission chapel sat broken-backed against the desert hills. Its roof collapsed years ago, its bell long gone. What remained was the frame, a stone arch still bearing soot from some long-ago fire, and a statue of the Virgin Mary, headless but still standing, watching over nothing but dust. Taya stood beside her sister, the false box clutched tight in her arms. It had been weathered, scratched, weighted with stones to mimic heft. Luma had wrapped it in the same cloth they'd found in Elias's cabin, faded green, smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. "You sure this is the place?" Luma asked, whispering. Taya nodded. "He'll come here. There's nowhere else he'd feel safe." Boone had chosen the location for a reason. The ground around the chapel sloped gently up to a ridge, offering cover and elevation. He'd ridden out before the sisters, posted himself above the site behind what had once been a crucifix, now reduced to splinters. His rifle rested steady on the rocks, eyes fixed through the sights. He didn't move, didn't blink. He was waiting. Just before the sun rose fully, they heard hooves. 3 riders. Brentwood led. He wore black, of course he did, with gloves and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded half his face. His mustache had grayed since the last time Boone saw him, but the posture hadn't changed. Proud, like rot dressed in silk. Behind him came 2 hired guns, and between them, bound and slumping, were 2 older Apache, their eyes swollen, wrists bruised. Taya stepped forward, but Luma gripped her wrist hard. "Not yet," she said. Brentwood dismounted. He didn't speak right away, just surveyed the chapel, the sisters, the box. Then he smiled, slow and snake-like. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this a holy gathering?" Taya said nothing. Her jaw tightened. She looked to the statue behind her. Brentwood followed her gaze. "That thing lost its head like most people lose their sense," he said. "Too long staring at nothing." He snapped his fingers. One of the men shoved the Apache couple forward. They stumbled. Boone's finger slid toward the trigger, slow as molasses. Not yet. Brentwood took a step closer. "I trust," he said, voice silk, "you've brought what belongs to me." Taya swallowed. "This is all of it," she said. "Then let's make this quick." Somewhere above them, wind rattled the loose stones. And from the ridge, Boone whispered to himself, "For everything there is a season." Brentwood circled the chapel like a man inspecting livestock. He stopped when he reached the Apache couple. The man's knees were bleeding, the woman's cheek bore a fresh welt. Brentwood tilted the man's chin with the barrel of his pistol. "Still breathing, eh? That's loyalty for you." He turned to the sisters. "And what have you 2 learned about loyalty, I wonder?" Taya said nothing. Her fingers whitened around the box.
Luma's eyes flicked upward, toward the ridge where she knew Elias waited. But she betrayed nothing, no glance, no twitch, only silence. Brentwood moved slowly, savoring the moment. "I once had a dog," he began, strolling lazily toward the center of the chapel ruins. "Mean as fire, bit everything that moved. One day he turned on me, bit clean through my hand." He held up his glove-covered left hand, flexed the fingers. "I didn't shoot him right away. I waited, watched, let him think he was safe again. Then I put him down clean." He smiled, not at them, but at the memory. Taya's voice was low but clear. "You talk too much." Brentwood stalked, tilted his head. "What's that, little bird?" "You talk too much," she repeated, "like you're trying to convince yourself." He blinked once, slowly, then laughed. "You think you're brave. I see that fire in your eyes. But you forget, you're still standing in my shadow." He gestured toward the couple. "I can put a bullet in both of them right now. You hand me the box, or I paint this chapel red." From the ridge, Elias watched it all unfold. His heart beat once for every memory that came surging back. The firelight in his old home, the scream that split the night, the stench of smoke and blood. He saw Brentwood now, not just as he was, but as he had always been. A man who wore civility like a coat, easy to take off. Elias whispered, "I remember the scar and the scream." His hands didn't tremble. Brentwood took a step toward Taya. Elias tightened his grip. Then a whisper through the dry brush, barely audible. A crunch of boot on stone. Luma turned her head ever so slightly. A nod from Taya. In that sliver of a moment, something shifted. Brentwood sensed it too. "Is there something I'm missing here?" he asked, eyes narrowing. From the shadows, Boone's finger brushed the trigger guard. "A time for every purpose under heaven." Brentwood's hand hovered near his belt, where the gleam of steel flashed beneath his coat. His eyes were moving now, darting, calculating. Something wasn't right. He took a step back, just enough to shift his weight toward the Apache prisoners. That's when Taya moved. Not with a scream, not with drama, but with the silence of someone who has already said goodbye. She stepped forward, smooth and quick, and before Brentwood could pivot, her arm flashed upward, driving the blade low into the muscle above his knee. The man roared, not from pain alone, but from surprise. He stumbled backward, the leg giving under him like a snapped branch. His pistol dropped to the dust. Chaos bloomed. One of the guards reached for his rifle, but didn't finish the motion. A single shot cracked from the ridge. The man's hat flew from his head, and his body folded like a paper doll. Luma screamed and dove toward her parents. The other guard lunged for the girls, but a second shot dropped him hard before he took 2 steps. Brentwood, bleeding and limping, scrambled toward his horse. "Taya!" Elias shouted. It was the first time he'd used her name aloud. She turned. Their eyes met, brief, electric. Behind her, Brentwood reached the saddlebag. His hand disappeared inside. Boone fired. The shot struck the ground near Brentwood's hand on purpose. The message was clear. Not yet. Taya took a shaky step back, breathing hard. Blood from Brentwood's wound spattered across her boot. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. Brentwood cursed. The bullet had missed, barely, but his weapon was out of reach now. He was on one knee, his leg useless, his hand bloodied and empty. Elias moved. He slid down the ridge like he had done 20 years ago. Except now there was no fear, no hesitation. Each footfall crushed the gravel with purpose. He passed the broken statue. He passed the box. And as he walked into the clearing, the light caught his face full on. Brentwood looked up. Their eyes locked. For a moment, the desert held its breath. "You," Brentwood spat. "I should have finished the job that night." Elias's voice was low. "And I should have buried you deeper." The words weren't fury. They were facts. He stepped closer. Brentwood clawed toward his belt again. Boone didn't wait. He raised the rifle, steady and sure. The final confrontation had begun. Brentwood knelt, blood soaking the dust beneath his leg. The desert sun finally climbed high enough to illuminate his face, creased, cruel, and cracking with disbelief. "You shouldn't be alive," he hissed, spitting blood. "They said you burned with the rest." Elias stood still, rifle steady in his arms. "You remember the fire," he said, voice quiet. "But do you remember the scream?" Brentwood blinked, then frowned. "The boy?" Elias continued. "The one you thought no one heard. That was me. Hiding beneath floorboards while your men drank themselves blind." Brentwood's mouth twisted. "I thought I smelled cowardice." Elias stepped closer, boots crunching over bone-dry gravel. "No," he said. "You smelled fear, but it didn't rot me. It fed me." Brentwood laughed, bitter, raspy. "So this is justice. You're just another man with a gun." Elias paused, then lowered the rifle, just a few inches. "I didn't come here for revenge," he said. "I came to give the dead their names back." He pulled from his coat pocket a folded paper, the first page of the ledger, stained and torn. He tossed it beside Brentwood. "Your list," he said. "Children, women, men, laborers who were promised wages, miners who never saw the sun again. My wife, my son." Brentwood didn't look. "You think names make a difference?" "They do," Elias said, lifting the rifle once more. "Especially when the devil starts counting." Brentwood stared at him. For the first time, something like fear showed in the man's eyes. Not of dying, but of being remembered for what he truly was. "You won't pull that trigger," he whispered. "You're not a killer." Elias breathed deep, let the desert fill his lungs, then replied, "Some debts come due, even without a bill." The shot rang out like thunder across dry stone. Brentwood jerked once, then fell. No scream, no curse, just dust. Silence returned to the chapel. Only the wind, whispering through the broken rafters, dared to speak. Taya stood frozen, Luma holding their parents. Elias walked to them, slowly, and set the rifle down beside the box. His eyes met Taya's. She nodded once, not as approval, but as understanding. From above, the statue of the Virgin still stood headless, but perhaps, in that moment, no longer blind. The dust hadn't settled, but time had. The chapel now felt hollow, like a breath held too long. The Apache couple sat huddled beside the broken wall, Luma curled beside her mother, her hand resting gently on the woman's weathered fingers. The old man clutched a water skin like prayer beads. Taya walked toward Elias. He stood at the altar, or what was left of it. Sunlight filtered through a crack above.
painting a cross of gold dust across his face and chest. She handed him the real box. He didn't speak. He knelt. The box creaked as it opened, old hinges protesting like they'd been waiting too long. Inside, wrapped in oilskin and silence, were 3 items. First, the ledger. He opened it. Page after page, lined in dark ink, recorded the names of laborers, transfers, wages withheld, deaths unreported. Some names were marked with an X. Others were listed with only numbers, flesh reduced to math. He flipped through until he found it. Santiago Redbear, collapsed in shaft 3, body unrecovered. Beside it, in smaller script, wife and daughter transferred, unpaid. Tea's breath caught. Luma reached over, touched the edge of the page like it might vanish. Second, the map. A hand-drawn layout of Calico Mine, with symbols marking unreported tunnels. One was circled. Vault scrawled beside it in Brentwood's handwriting. And finally, the coin. A Spanish silver real minted in 1805. It glimmered in the sun like truth rising. Elias placed the coin on the ledger, shut the box, and handed it to Luma. "I held it long enough," he said. Her eyes were wide. "You're giving it to us?" "No," he answered softly. "I'm returning it." Luma's hands trembled as she received it. Tea opened her mouth, but no words came. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Elias. He did not flinch. He let her. The chapel, broken and godless as it seemed, bore witness to a sacred exchange, not just of information, but of memory, of burden, of lineage. Outside, a wind picked up. It rattled the bones of the land. And Elias, standing alone once more, looked down at his hands. Not bloody, not shaking, just old, but clean. They buried the dead in silence, not Brentwood. He was left for the crows, like every truth too long ignored. But the Apache couple, broken and trembling, insisted on marking a small mound for one of their kin lost long ago in the mines. Elias gave them his only cross, wooden, weather-worn, carved by hand long ago when grief had nowhere else to go. Tea stood beside the grave, hands folded. Luma placed the Spanish coin beneath the stone, like a seal, not payment, a remembrance. Back in the chapel, the light had shifted. Sunset now sliced through the cracks, painting long red lines across the altar. Elias sat alone on the front pew. In his lap, the Bible. Not opened at random, no. He had turned to it carefully, as if guided not by hand, but by memory. His finger paused on a passage he hadn't read aloud in years. "For everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to kill and a time to heal." Ecclesiastes 3:1-3. He closed the book gently. The dust swirled around it, but didn't settle. Tea approached. "Will you come with us?" she asked softly. He looked up, not surprised, not reluctant, just thoughtful. "I can't," he said, "but I'll walk to the edge." She nodded, accepting what he meant. Outside, Luma was tending to the horses. The couple sat quietly, leaning on each other, the box resting between them like a fragile future. Elias walked out last. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. As the wagon rolled away, drawn slow under the burning sky, Elias stood at the ridge beside the chapel, his silhouette long and lean. For the first time in 20 years, he had no weapon in hand. Only the wind, only the hush, only the weight of a story that no longer needed telling, because it had been heard. He turned back once, toward the grave, toward the open door, toward the empty desert. Then he began to walk, not away, not toward, just forward. One step, then another.
and the wind carried a new sound. Not a scream, not a gunshot, but the quiet voice of peace. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The rosemary took root in dry, bitter soil. Elias knelt beside the grave, fingers calloused, pressing each sprig with careful force. No one watched him, not that he would have minded. He had done this before, years ago, with nothing more than bare dirt and a broken heart. But now he planted for more than memory. He planted for mercy. The cross still stood, barely. Wind tugged at the ribbon tied to its beam, his daughter's old bonnet string, bleached by years of sun. He didn't touch it, just looked, then lowered his head. A single word broke the silence. Peace. He didn't know if it was a prayer, a hope, or a surrender. When he stood, he didn't sigh. He simply reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the box. It looked smaller now, lighter somehow. He didn't open it, didn't need to. He placed it atop a folded burlap sack and tied it twice, firm and steady. Then he tucked the bundle under his arm and walked down the slope. Half a mile east, just beyond the last cottonwood tree, sat a stagecoach depot long abandoned, now turned into a dry post drop.
He opened the wooden crate marked "For Collection," placed the bundle inside, and wrote a name in chalk across the lid. For Samuel Trask, attorney, San Miguel. He left no note, just stepped back, dusted his hands, and looked once toward the west, where the hills swallowed the sun like the last page of a long story. He hadn't chosen this end, but he had chosen the gesture, and that made all the difference. Back at the grave, the wind had calmed. The rosemary bent gently in rows, quiet as a choir of old women praying. The bonnet string no longer fluttered. It lay still, like a ribbon laid down in peace. Elias stood there again before dusk fell fully. He touched the soil once more, not to test it, not to press it, just to feel it, and whispered, "You're not waiting any more, so neither will I." The desert night descended without drama. No gunfire, no howling wind, no horses pounding the earth. Just a man, a patch of rosemary, and a silence that did not ache. They left before dawn. No goodbyes, no embraces. That wasn't how people like them said farewell. Not when life had taught them that promises fade and only footprints in the dust remain. Elias stood by the fence, leaning just enough to rest his weight, not enough to seem sentimental. The wagon wheels cracked faintly in the distance, headed south, toward the river crossings, and, maybe, toward a life not bought with silence. Luma sat beside her mother, her hand gently covering the woman's fingers, as if trying to reteach her touch. Taya turned once, not to wave, but to see if he'd moved. He hadn't. At the cabin's door, nailed carefully to the cedar beam, was a plank of old pine. It hadn't been there yesterday. Elias hadn't noticed it until the wagon disappeared beyond the ridge. He walked over, slow. It was carved, not with a knife, but burned in, steady, deliberate strokes that must have taken the better part of the night. The letters weren't perfect, but they were permanent. A man with no claim still gave us back our names. Below that, smaller still, Taya and Luma. Elias didn't smile, but something behind his eyes softened, like fire lowering in a hearth. He reached up and touched the wood once, then stepped back. His hat hung low. His boots made no sound against the porch boards. Inside, the cabin was still. The soup pot empty, the beds folded. The Bible still on the table, open to a page now torn slightly at the corner. He didn't mark the page, didn't need to. Some words don't need keeping if they've already been planted. Outside, the wind carried no dust, just the smell of sage and smoke wood. Elias sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun climb.
He didn't call out, he didn't write letters. Some men speak once and let the land echo them for decades. He had spoken enough. Now he listened. And the world, for once, was kind enough to listen back. The saddle creaked like an old hymn. Elias cinched the last strap, not hurried, not slow, just steady, as if each movement mattered in a world that finally stopped asking why. He wore his oldest coat, the one his wife had patched years ago, with a square of fabric from her Sunday dress. The stitching still held. The hat, dusty, wide-brimmed, bent at one side, rested gently on his head like a final thought. On his hip, no gun, just the knife. The same one he had handed to Taya, the same one now returned, dull but unbroken. It rode in a leather sheath tied to his belt, not for violence, but for memory.
He tucked the Bible into his saddlebag, its cover frayed, its corners bent from decades of being opened in silence. The bookmark, a dried sprig of rosemary. He looked once more at the cabin, not to check, not to reconsider, just to see it one last time under morning light. A home not for glory, a home for ghosts now quiet. He mounted. The horse shifted beneath him, sensing no urgency, only direction. Elias didn't urge it forward. He simply loosened the reins, and the horse began to walk. South, not fast, not slow, just forward. Toward no town, toward no battle, toward no one, just toward whatever lay beyond the next ridge. He did not ride toward glory. He rode away from it, toward something quieter, toward something smaller than justice, but truer than revenge. The dust rose behind him, not high, not wild, just enough to say someone passed through here, someone who had carried more than bullets and more than guilt, and finally laid it down. In the hush that followed, the land remained still. The rosemary by the grave took root. The words on the wooden plank faded slowly under sun. But somewhere, miles down the trail, beneath his coat, inside the saddlebag lined with threadbare faith, was a single verse pressed into the pages like a whisper that wouldn't leave. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." Matthew 5:9. He didn't need to read it. He was writing it, one quiet step at a time. Some stories don't need a hero in shining armor. They need a man like Elias, weathered, flawed, but faithful. A man who chose quiet mercy over vengeance, who planted rosemary where others might have sown rage. And maybe, just maybe, you've known someone like him. Perhaps it was your grandfather, your mother, a friend from the war, or even yourself in a quieter season of life, facing ghosts no one else could see and choosing stillness over noise. The desert doesn't forget, nor do we, because in every true Wild West story, behind the grit and the guns, there is grace. And sometimes it's the softest gesture, a bowl of soup, a shared silence, a ride into nothing, that says the most. If this story stirred something in you, an old memory, a long-lost name, or a simple prayer whispered in the dark, share it. Let others remember what the West truly was. Not lawless, but longing. Not violent, but vast, with room enough for redemption. Subscribe to keep riding with us through stories that honor the heart of the old frontier. Because some trails are still worth following.